Yo legends, enjoy the story and let me know how it hits. On the hot stove there was a deep frying pan in which the prepared food was bubbling. A girl in a light pink apron was deftly cutting leeks into small pieces. She brought a spoon of hot broth to her mouth to check the readiness of the dish. The wall clock, which showed 7 hours and 24 minutes, made her mouth open. The girl carefully opened the door of the room in which the light was not on. There was a sleeping guy lying in the bed under the blanket. The girl carefully sat down on the bed and patted his legs, saying that it was time to get up. She began to shake him by the side, saying that the young man might be late. He muttered something in his sleep. His ear twitched when he heard him being called father. The guy opened his eyes in fear, rising from the bed. He opened his mouth in bewilderment, scratching his head and smiling. The young man replied that he was already getting up. The girl exhaled. A friendly smile appeared on her face. She clasped her hands behind her back and, closing her eyes, told her father to quickly get up and go to breakfast. The guy thought that 2 months ago, because of his father's contract, he unexpectedly had a daughter 10 years ago. A fault appeared on Earth, disrupting harmony and tranquility. People noticing its appearance were horrified, not understanding what it was. The men with fear on their faces began to run away. From the open gap in space, anthropomorphic monsters with many teeth and extra limbs appeared from the rift in unimaginable quantities, which were impossible for an ordinary person to cope with. However, strange abilities awakened in some people regardless of gender and age. An armored man with a sword and a girl in a red suit stood in front of the monsters emerging from the portal. They called themselves hunters and without hesitation entered into battle. With the fiends of the rift, each of them could see and adjust their abilities using a status window very much reminiscent of the game interface. In the open window, the name, level, title, characteristics and abilities were written. The hunter controlling the window said that he still had enough strength. The girl in the red suit firmly stated that they should try again. The man in yellow armor agreed with this, and behind them stood several more hunters ready for battle. However, the main character did not have these abilities, and after serving in the army he quietly studied for 3 years, dodged and sat at his desk surrounded by books and wrote something in a notebook. Then he managed to get a job as a civil servant in one of the technical positions in the fault department and became the most junior among the other employees. The man at the computer desk asked how things were going with the report. The guy jumped up from his workplace. The young man did not shine with special talents. The curly-haired man waved his finger meaningly, asking if he was going to continue doing this. The character asked for forgiveness. But after a year of hard work he was still able to get the first task. Expecting a lot from the first serious day, John walked along the pedestrian crossing looking at his phone. After work he went to the canyon area in search of a fault that had appeared there. But suddenly turned around, seeing a bright light from the side. A car was moving towards him at great speed. The guy did not have time to react. On the street on which there was not a single person, a terrible metal clang was heard. On the way to the desired place he was hit by a truck, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. The young man woke up lying on the ground. The place where he came to his senses was a world called Murim. Men in medieval costumes looked at him in surprise as if he were an alien. With pagodas standing behind them, there was a fight in the large hall. People in gray suits were attacking each other with swords. Someone was lying on the floor motionless. One of the warriors cut the main character's back, forcing him to close his eyes. In pain he died many times. His body lay on the floor in a pool of blood. After he woke up in this world, he acquired the ability to revive him after death. The pocket watch was shrouded in haze. It returned its owner a day back in the event of death. John raised his sword above his head, preparing to attack. Armed people attacked him at once, screaming. The guy returned after death again and again. At some point he forgot his name, but finally became the strongest in Murim. The warrior sat on a destroyed column among many corpses against the backdrop of a fire. The residents of Mam nicknamed him Chin, which means heavenly devil. The bloodied warrior held his sword in his hands, thinking that he had become the strongest. Looking forward from under his brows, he did not understand how he could return back to his home world. The young man became the first, and as a reward he received the same sudden return to his reality. He woke up in a dressing gown in a hospital bed. When the patient was about to leave the hospital, the doctor behind him worriedly asked if everything was all right, and the nurse, covering his mouth with his hands, told him to come back immediately if anything hurt. Holding a sick leave certificate in her hands, the nurse clarified whether this was the same man who was hit by a truck and who had undergone a 17-hour operation the day before. The man, his mouth open in surprise, said that he already doubted it. The main character went out onto the street with many skyscrapers around, realizing that he did not remember Korea well and that it would take him a lot of time to adapt Dodge. And opened the status window. All his stats were level 999. He thought that he had become so strong that he didn't have to work. The guy in the formal suit looked at his hands, realizing how much blood was on them. Memories of all the events that happened in Murim, all the battles and fights, flashed through his head. Constant betrayals, countless deaths and revivals brought him to complete distrust of anyone. Stopping in the middle of the road, he thought that he would like to be normal, fixing his gaze upward. The young man decided that this time he wanted to live an ordinary, quiet life. There was a huge clock hanging on the Seoul City Hall building. The doors were open, and the main character greeted his colleagues. The office workers looked at him in shock, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands in amazement. The curly-haired man opened his eyes wide and asked if everything was okay. With a Kalic expression on his face, Jun replied that nothing had happened to him. His colleague said that in appearance nothing had really changed. Raising his eyebrows high, the man noticed that his colleague began to talk strangely. The guy, looking away and scratching his cheek, asked about how his speech sounded. Before, a badge hung around his neck. His work uniform fit loosely on him. But the employees still noticed that his body seemed to have become stronger, although before he was fragile and timid. The curly-haired man, looking into his eyes, said that his height had also changed. Scratching his chin, the young man thanked him for the information. The senior colleague, waving his hand and squinting, asked if it was another person standing in front of him. Keeping a calm expression on his face, the young man replied that they may think that something in him has changed a lot, but it really is him. They stood in the middle of the office. The main character explained that he was still in shock from the accident and had memory problems, and asked where his place was. Crossing his arms over his chest and raising one eyebrow, the curly-haired man, not believing that his old colleague was standing in front of him, said that this forgetfulness made him even more suspicious. The woman, clasping her hands, noticed that in front of them was indeed Jun, just more handsome, but the employee turned around and still asked Hyunu to bring a fingerprint scanner. The office worker showed a small device that will confirm identity using the right thumbprint. The guy put his finger on the scanner. Everyone looked at the device, the voice from which confirmed the identity of the Rift department worker. The curly-haired man asked him to place his finger again, and the robotic voice repeated what had been said. Refusing to believe it, the employee raised his hands and asked to do it again. Squinting, he stated that a person cannot change so much in just a day. The woman, looking admiringly at her colleague, suggested that these were the consequences of amnesia and noticed that his speech had become more intelligible. The man looked at her, saying that the change in height looked much more suspicious, but the employee, with a blush on her cheeks, only smiled, answering that she was not so worried about it, putting his hand to his temple. The young man once again asked to indicate where his seats were. His colleague waved his hand, saying that he should go home today and have a good rest. Pouting his lip, he clarified that the sick leave had not ended yet and that he could start work tomorrow. Grabbing the main character by the shoulders, the man was about to accompany him, but he declared that he could walk home himself. Cumulus clouds floated across the clear sky. Jun recognized the building and approached the apartment building. He walked up the stairs to his floor. The guy put his hand on the combination lock. Almost immediately he removed his hand, standing in front of the door. The young man could not remember the code. Someone's voice came from the apartment, causing the main character to tense up. Look down. The girl, peeking out from behind the door, called him uncle. The owner of the apartment fearfully asked who she was. The sun illuminated the apartment building. They sat at the table opposite each other. Jun took a sip from his mug, looking at the sad girl. He asked who she was, taking the mug away from his mouth. The guy clarified whether the girl sitting in front of him was his brother's daughter. She nodded her head affirmatively. The young man put the mug on the table and clarified the fact that he agreed to look after her because her mother died in an accident and she had nowhere to go. The main character said that he gave her the code to the apartment and that's why she came today. The girl, clasping her hands together, answered in the affirmative, putting his hand to his chin. Thoughtfully, Jun asked if they had met before. Waving her hand and smiling, she replied that today they were seeing each other for the first time. Irritably covering his face with his hand, the guy wanted to know if she had other relatives. Nervously clasping her hands and lowering her gaze, the girl replied that her mother was an orphan and that she had no one else to rely on. The young man noticed a plate of food on the table and asked what it was. On the plate was an omelette with rice covered with red sauce and vegetables. The girl replied that she made the omelette for her uncle to eat after work. The words that he was not ready to welcome her into his home made her eyes widen. The girl jumped up from the table, placing her hands on it, and exclaimed that the main character had promised to shelter her. She showed the phone to her uncle, who did not understand anything in the correspondence from 2 days ago. It was said that Jun himself invited her to stay at his house and that this would not cause him any inconvenience. He confirmed that he really wrote these messages. Taking the mug in his hands again, the guy said that until yesterday he was in the hospital because he had an accident and was discharged only today. Rising from the table, the young man clarified that he had lost his memory. The girl looked at him, asking if everything was okay. Her uncle brought the mug to the sink and replied that his body had fully recovered. Having opened the water and wiped the mug with a rag, he added that his memory was failing him greatly and that this could cause some difficulties in everyday life. Having placed a clean mug on the tabletop, the main character said that now it would be difficult for him to take care of someone because it would take some time to adapt to everyday life. The girl put her hand out in front of her, discouraged, opening her mouth. She exclaimed that they needed to agree and draw up a contract. The Jun turned around, asking what contract he was talking about. Placing his hand on her chest, the girl asked him to become her father until she graduated from school. Looking down, the guy asked incomprehensibly what she was talking about. The girl grabbed his hand, saying that it would be difficult for him to live alone due to memory loss and that it would be difficult for him to clean, do laundry and cook on his own. Holding his shirt sleeve tightly, she added that in exchange for help around the house he would let her live in his apartment until she graduated from high school. Looking pleadingly into his eyes, the girl asked to live with him for at least 6 months until she had the opportunity to move into a dormitory. Looking at her, the young man thought that these were very good conditions. He imagined himself standing in medieval costume on the streets of Seoul and thought that due to his long stay in Europe it would take a long time to adapt to the modern world, and that he now had someone from whom he could learn something or ask for help. Thoughtfully putting his hand to his chin, the guy decided that this was very beneficial for both. The main character took his bag, offering to draw up a contract. The girl widened her eyes, having no idea what kind of contract we were talking about. The Jun sat down at the table and began to write something on a piece of paper. He handed her the contract he had drawn up. It was written on paper that in exchange for accommodation until the end of the year and provision of funds for expenses, Seal Uni undertakes to provide and account for all checks and receipts for the use of funds for accommodation and pocket expenses, as well as complete all homework for the duration of the contract. Taking the paper and reading what was written, the girl agreed. The guy asked if everything was clear and if anything needed to be corrected, to which the niece holding the contract before her eyes replied that everything was in order. The young man handed her a pen, asking her to sign the paper. Tears welled up in Yuna's eyes. Her uncle hoped they would get along. The girl bowed to express her gratitude and promised to do her best. Smiling, she expressed her desire to call him her father. The main character replied that he did not mind. Jun was about to leave the room. The girl asked him to call her by name and address her as you want. He agreed. Still holding the piece of paper, Uni thought that her new father was getting used to what was happening pretty quickly. She looked into his room, wanting to say something else, but found him changing clothes and saw his muscular body. Out of embarrassment, the girl covered her mouth with her hands and a red blush appeared on her cheeks. She quickly turned away and apologized for the intrusion, turning around. The guy asked what happened. Embarrassedly scratching her cheek, the girl said that the refrigerator was empty and they needed to go to the store for groceries. She stood in the door with her back to her father. The young man took out his wallet. There was a bank card in his hand. The main character asked his niece to pay for all his purchases with her. Uni took the card in her hands and looked at it in bewilderment, holding the card to her chest. The girl looked at her uncle and offered to go to the store together because it could return some part of his memory. Looking down, Jun replied that it might work and agreed to go to the store. A sign hung above the glass doors. And a row of shopping carts stood nearby. They stood at the vegetable section. A huge green field was visible in the window. You noted that for a while it would be necessary to prepare food from fresh vegetables. Then she noticed that pork belly costs 10,000 won for 600 G. The guy thought that it was sale. After the words of gratitude, the girl sheepishly scratched her cheek. Some noise behind them made them turn around. The girl opened her mouth in surprise. The young man asked what happened. A rift opened in the middle of the store and frightened customers rushed to run away from the portal. Uni took a gun out of her back. Holding her weapon out in front of her, she shouted that there was a rift in front of them and ordered her father to hide because it was too dangerous here. A snarling green monster with sharp fangs emerged from the rift. People were running away from the department in which the portal had opened. A young man in a blue hoodie shouted that there was a goblin. In front of him, the main character watched what was happening with an absolutely calm expression on his face. Yellow energy has accumulated at the barrel of the gun. Immediately after this, a beam of light erupted from the weapon. A wave of energy passed right through the monster's body. The goblin growled in shock as he looked at the hole in his chest. Not even a second had passed before his body collapsed on the floor of the store. One of the customers covered her mouth with her hand, saying that the goblin had lost consciousness. Someone was standing with a bat in his hands. The man said that they were lucky that there was a hunter in the store. Yui breathed a sigh of relief. Jun realized that his niece was a hunter. The girl put the gun in her bag and asked, displeased, why her father didn't hide. Because he could have gotten hurt. The guy apologized and said that he would be careful in the future. The girl pursed her lips pitifully, wanting to know if this was true. The answer was in the affirmative. The police who arrived at the scene took photographs of the monster's body. One of them, holding a notebook in his hand, stated that there was only one goblin and that there were no dead. The policeman turned to the heroes while his colleagues were inspecting the scene and asked the young man whether the monster had died by his hand. The main character pushed Eve forward, taking her by the shoulders, and said that his daughter had dealt with the goblin. The man in uniform opened his mouth in surprise. He then asked for identification, telephone number, address, and bank account number. The officer, looking at the guy, explained that this data was needed to receive a reward. The policeman clarified that this was the price for destroying the monster and the spent mana, and that this was a reward for preserving the lives and safety of the residents. The girl was very happy about this news after saying that his father could provide a bank account. Jun thoughtfully touched his chin with his fingers. Looking at his niece, he decided that it would be fair if the money was transferred to her account because this was a reward for her work. She smiled. A red blush appeared on her face. It was night outside, but there was light in the windows of the house. The phone on the table vibrated, and Uni took a break from cooking to look at the message, taking the phone in her hands. She was very surprised. The message said that for destroying the rift and killing the monster, the Seoul Police Department transferred 150,000 won to her. The guy behind her said that this was a lot, and in surprise the girl pressed the phone to her chest. Her uncle looked at her and expressed his opinion that there was no point in her living in his apartment if they paid so much money for killing one monster. Smiling, the girl replied that it was a special situation because the break was temporary and no one guarantees that all monsters will be as weak as that goblin. She also added that only a licensed hunter or the associated angels of death can enter the rift called the dungeon, and this is not available to her due to the fact that she is an ordinary person. The young man, displeased, crossed his arms over his chest and looked away. The main character asked if his niece had studied the law of reason. The girl looked at him questioningly, not understanding what he was talking about. Raising his index finger to his head, Dunn answered the question of what the law of mind means, saying that it is the ability to absorb energy from the outside. Not wanting to continue the explanation, he lowered his hand and concluded that there was nothing special about it. Uni closed her eyes and smiled, saying that this all must be surprising, but she plans to enter the State Hunter Academy in March. Taking the frying pan in her hands and putting the prepared food on a plate, the girl added that her power has not yet awakened, but she can use mana, and she also has permission to use the mana gun which she always has in her back. Sitting down at the table, the guy praised her, saying that not everyone can become a hunter. The niece, holding a spatula in her hands, said that therefore she should be treated well. Raising her hand and smiling, she said that she would become very famous one day. There were a lot of Korean dishes on the table. He wished her a bon appetit and asked her to eat everything without leaving anything. Taking a spoon in her hand, the girl asked what her father's job was. The young man, putting a spoonful into his mouth, replied that he worked at the mayor's office. His daughter asked if this meant that he was a civil servant. The guy confirmed this. Smiling, the girl expressed her concern that his work could be dangerous. She pushed a plate of meat towards him and once again wished him bon appetit. The sun was shining on the City Hall building. The clock showed almost 9 o'clock in the morning. The wall clock in the office showed the same time. The main character entered his office greeting his colleagues. The curly-haired man was surprised by his appearance. His face looked worried and he asked if everything was okay and if the employee would be able to work today. Looking at him, Jun thanked him for his concern and said that everything was fine. Crossing his arms over his chest, the man asked to contact him if any questions arise because health comes first. He pointed to the computer desk and told the guy that was where he belonged. The bespectacled employee at the next table said he would answer any questions if the amnesia had not yet passed. The young man looked at him, not remembering his name. The man said that he was his senior Hyuksu. The main character bowed and thanked him. The curly-haired worker looked at his watch and declared that the time had already come. The boss ordered to bring a very valuable hunter up to date, to which the employee exhaled irritably, doubting that the F rank was valuable. The man with glasses smiled, stating that despite his rank, a hunter is a hunter. Everyone turned around when a man came into the office and immediately apologized for being late. The girl with pink hair was trying to catch her breath. Wiping the sweat from her brow, the new girl smiled and asked if she was too late. The curly-haired worker spread his hands, saying that he had to go out and meet her. The girl bowed and once again asked for forgiveness. While they were talking, Hayaka pointed at them with his hand and asked the main character to say hello to their new hunter. Dojin looked around questioningly. Taking him by the hand, the senior took him aside. Realizing that most likely his subordinate did not remember something, the guy listened carefully to the words that their department was mainly engaged in searching for faults, going on missions together with a hunter. Pointing to the girl, he explained that Yeji would be in the young man's care. The main character greeted, maintaining a comic expression on his face. Yeji looked at him admiringly. The boss specified that she was supposed to become his partner. After these words, they both stared at the senior in confusion. Smiling shyly, the man scratched his cheek. Looking at them, he explained that Dojin is not in a state to go out on a mission right now, so the employee will take over this matter. The guy lowered his eyebrows in displeasure, asking if this work was originally his occupation. Closing his eyes in confusion, the senior answered in the affirmative and said that he would take care of it himself because it was unknown what the consequence of the accident might be. They turned around when the curly-haired man expressed his concern that his colleague had injured his head and was unlikely to be able to work normally, having widened his eyes. In alarm, the young man thought that they were pretending that he was an unscrupulous worker. Immediately turning serious, he confidently declared that he would do his job. Dojin's subordinate raised his hands in discouragement, saying that he shouldn't overexert himself. The curly-haired man clenched his fist, supporting the senior and saying that the main character, who could not even find his place, needed rest, especially since they had already received official notice that the senior would be working with him. Dojin clenched his fists angrily and squinted his eyes, lowering his eyebrows. He declared that he would carry out his direct duties himself. When asked to allow him to take part in the task, the senior only shook his shoulders. The sun reflected in the panoramic windows of the city's skyscrapers. Employees of the city hall were sitting on a bench. In front of the store, a curly-haired man asked if his colleague had gone crazy, knowing what the main character could do. The senior replied that he understood his concern. Taking a sip from a can of cola, he asked to give his subordinate another chance because he was their employee. The curly-haired worker lowered his eyebrows in displeasure. There was a cry of satisfaction. The sun's rays illuminated the huge building. An employee of the fault management department and his partner were traveling in a taxi, sitting in the front seat and holding a pile of paper in his hands. The main character decided that this would be quite enough. Looking down, he thought that, after several readings of the instructions, he understood what and how to do, and that it was his direct responsibility to study all the information about. The fault support from the Hunter Academy is allocated for this work, but a lot of false documents began to circulate between large guilds, which began to cause problems, and even the government began to use them. A voice from the back seat distracted Dojin from his thoughts. The girl introduced herself and said that she was 21 years old. Turning around, the guy apologized, explaining that he was checking the documents. She laughed and said that everything was fine. Noticing something in her hands, the young man asked what it was on her lap. Yeji explained that this was a case for the uniform and weapons needed to fight monsters. The taxi driver stopped the car and, looking out the open window, said that they had arrived. The heroes thanked the taxi driver. Mountains were visible ahead. The taxi driver dropped them off on the side of the road in the forest. The metal case opened to reveal a small green ball. The girl put it to her chest. The sphere in her hands began to glow. At the same moment, her clothes turned into a gray tight suit. The main character was surprised when he looked at the hunter. Yeji turned around and, smiling, asked if it was the first time her partner had seen something like that. The answer was in the affirmative. They headed towards the security personnel who were waiting for them. The girl explained that this suit has the lowest level of protection but still costs 3 million won. When asked about the sword, she replied that she was holding a D-rank skeleton monster sword, and unlike suit, this weapon is not very expensive. Splitting the hilt of the sword to her chest, she asked what she should call her partner. Dojin replied that it was not important for him. Approaching the checkpoint, the hunter gave her things to the employee and said that she would call to the guy manager. Since he was responsible for the faults, the young man agreed. The security officer completed the check and allowed them to move on. They walked along the path of a forest park. A rift appeared right in front of them under the bridge. Looking at it, Yeji said that this was her first time doing this alone. A voice came from behind and asked who they were. 3 hunters were moving towards the rift. One of them said that they had not seen each other for a long time and that he thought that the girl had ceased to be a hunter. Yeji opened her mouth in shock. A man with a mohawk came close enough to them and asked if she had joined the guild. Smiling arrogantly, the hunter was surprised that someone accepted into the guild, a person who did not even know how to enter mana. The girl looked down, offended. The main character carefully watched as the rude man sarcastically praised his partner. Dunn turned to her asking if Yeji knew this hunter, to which she replied that they went to training courses together. Only now noticing an employee from the fault department, the man looked at him questioningly. Seeing his badge, the fighter laughed, realizing that the girl was working under a contract.